pleased to put on jointly with our partners for this, the Carnegie Middle East Center and the Arab Reform Initiative, which is a group based in Paris working with about 15 Arab research centers and think tanks on reform issues in the Arab world. If you don't know about the Arab Reform Initiative, you should check out their website. They do some very interesting and important research and advocacy work. And the Carnegie Middle East Center, based in Beirut, you all know about, and they also do a lot of good work. And we are very happy to be partnering with them on this panel discussion looking at Arab sovereign wealth funds, their growth, relevance, and prospects. The speakers will each speak for 10 minutes. We're going to be very strict with the timing, keep it short, sweet, get right to the point, and then have more time for discussion. If you want to read more about these issues, the papers of 3 of the speakers are available in those Carnegie published monographs over there. And Daniel Reich is speaking. He's professor at AUB, but his paper is not part of that, but his paper is also available. You'll find it on the relevant websites, which he'll tell you about. But the speakers today are Sven Behrendt, who will start. Sven is visiting scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Beirut. He has a history of research and writing on economic affairs and other contemporary issues. Then we'll have Dr. Brahim Wardi, who is adjunct professor of international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and he has done a lot of work in recent years on various aspects of money and finance, and has written on sovereign wealth funds. And then I will make some comments on Rami Khouri, director of the Hassan Fares Institute, and then Daniel Reicha will speak about, he's assistant professor of comparative politics at AUB, and he will talk about an example of sovereign wealth fund management and investment from Norway that he has written about as an interesting example of how sovereign wealth funds can be a mechanism for socially responsible, environmentally sensitive investment. So without further ado, we will start, and I invite Sven to give the first comments, and I will tap my pen when you have a minute left.
Thanks, Rami, and thanks for the Hassan Fares Institute for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to discuss some of the findings of our research reports, managing Arab sovereign wealth in turbulent times and beyond turbulent times. They certainly are. Jumping right into the issue, sovereign wealth funds. I think the emergence of sovereign wealth funds is an interesting phenomenon about globalization. It's an interesting phenomenon when we look into the dispersion of power in the political and economic system. It's an interesting phenomenon when we look into the movement of a once peripheral player into a central player in the global economic system, political system, and eventually also a strong indication about the balances of powers, the shifting balances of powers that we observe in the global system in this still young 21st century. Just to bring us all on the same page for the discussion, what are sovereign wealth funds? And I'll just give you a definition. Sovereign wealth funds are government-owned investment funds which are commonly funded by the transfer of foreign exchange assets. In the case of the Arab world, these foreign exchange assets are certainly the tremendous incomes derived from the surge of the oil price. We all remember the price of oil was, I think, in June 2008, July, at something just below $150 per barrel. So that is quite substantial, and that really was the main source of funding for Arab sovereign wealth funds. Of course, Arab sovereign wealth funds have existed for some time. The first Arab sovereign wealth fund has been created in the 1950s. I think it was 93 or 96, the Kuwait Investment Authority. Then you had the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. But really, they reached a global prominence, and they really burst into the central stage in the international economy and in financial markets at the beginning of this decade, by the turn of the century. Of the 44 government-owned investment vehicles that are labeled sovereign wealth funds, 24 were created only since 2000. This is also indicative for the Arab world. The bulk of sovereign wealth funds from the Arab world were created in the past couple of years. So we have the rise of sovereign wealth funds, and in particular from sovereign wealth funds from the Arab world into a globally relevant investor class. Other investor classes being mutual funds, pension funds, insurance assets. Until recently, Arab sovereign wealth funds as an investor class were speculated to control or manage around $3 trillion US, of which 1.5 trillion were controlled by Arab sovereign wealth funds. So that is, say, the speculation that we had until, say, summer 2008, late 2008. Just to recap the different funds themselves, who are they? I just mentioned the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. This is speculated to be managing assets in the size of hundreds of billions of US dollars. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority is known for its very opaque and secret way of doing things. Therefore, there's a huge amount of speculation about its real worth. One of its most important public acquisition, though, is a considerable stake in Citigroup some 15 months ago. Then in Abu Dhabi, you have other funds like the International Petroleum Investment Company, which is looking into petrochemicals and the chemical sector. Then you have in Abu Dhabi again the Mubadala Development Corporation, which looks into the diversification of the economic structure or the economy of Abu Dhabi. Then further up the Gulf, you have the Qatar Investment Authority with important stakes in Credit Suisse, in Barclays and the London Stock Exchange, for example. Then further up the Gulf again, you have the Kuwait Investment Authority, which has important stakes in BP, Daimler, the famously infamous Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, and so on and so forth. Then finally, you have a big player, the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, which is supposed to manage anything between 300 and 500 billion US dollars. Very conservative investor. There's a little bit of a discussion amongst the experts whether they qualify as a sovereign wealth fund or whether they are not just the central bank of Saudi Arabia and therefore fall under a different category. Sovereign wealth funds are not exactly the beacon of transparency. There's fairly little known about them, about their exact holdings and the value of their assets. And that has caused, of course, a lot of eyebrows in the West when they engaged in a more activist investment style, taking acquisitions or taking positions in Western assets. Of course, they poured billions into European and US financial assets. This is also when the political system in Europe and the United States reacted, in my opinion, overreacted. The starting point for this reaction is perhaps best illustrated by a quote or by a phrase that was coined by Lawrence Summers, who argued that sovereign wealth funds shake the logic of capitalism. I think that this statement illustrates very well the sentiment in the United States and in Europe. And that sentiment fairly quickly moved from public debate to real politics. And it's interesting how the various governments in the West, in Europe and the United States reacted to that. For example, the government of the UK was initially quite positive about sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds also investing a lot in the financial services sectors in the UK. The French President Nicolas Sarkozy at some stage addressing the European Parliament called for European governments to create their own sovereign wealth funds in order to protect their industries. Germany revised its foreign trade law, which in effect scrutinizes non-European foreign investments that target more than 25% of any major German enterprise. and so on and so forth. Sovereign wealth funds themselves reacted to this political backlash. They created a voluntary initiative which resulted in the drafting of what is called Santiago Principles. Santiago Principles is an effort to put a little bit more stringency and a little bit more coherence into the government's ruling, asset management, accountability, transparency of sovereign wealth funds. But we have to see where the Santiago Principles in the end will land. It is one thing to call for some principles, and it's yet another thing to implement them. So in late summer 2008, we had a situation where sovereign wealth funds appeared to be the new global power brokers, as McKinsey coined that situation or that phenomenon, potentially yielding considerable influence. You had the industrialized world reacting to this emergence and taking mostly defensive posture. You had also sovereign wealth funds attempting to self-regulate. But then, of course, the global financial crisis hit the world in full force. Lehman Brothers went bust, and things went out of control in financial markets. Of course, some wealth funds were affected as well, but I think Ibrahim will talk us through this financial markets of the past couple of months, the impact on sovereign wealth funds.
Okay, so first of all, let me thank you all. Okay.
I want you to understand the amazing performance. Only a German could actually speak less than 10 minutes. That was pretty amazing. So Ibrahim is an Arab, you get an extra minute.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank the organizers for organizing this event, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to pick up pretty much where Sven left off, which is where are things now. But at the same time, I'm going to have a few references to recent history to give you a sense of what's going on in terms of the world of sovereign funds. The interesting thing about the time when sovereign funds kind of burst upon the international scene was that it was a time when big financial institutions were starting to hurt, but it was still pretty much invisible outside of the banking sector. That is, nobody anticipated the extent of the financial crisis. So there was a time in the fall of 2007 where just about every week or so there was an announcement of some sovereign fund acquiring shares in this or that big financial institution. And at that time, there was, I don't know if you know here the name Jim Cramer, who's like one of the star financial analysts who used to be kind of a booster for stock market investment, and he's a bit of a guru in terms of those who watch financial programs all day long. And at one point, when this was taking place, he asked the question, should we allow our banks to be taken over by communists or terrorists? Okay, read China and the Arabs. And he said, I'll answer yes, because at this point we're desperate for capital. Because what was happening was that the shares of a number of financial institutions were going down, and there weren't willing buyers outside of sovereign wealth funds. Now, a lot of my other work is about the financial aspects of the war on terror, and the fact that there was what I call a system of gated finance, where a number of people were not welcome. And there had been the incident that you probably still remember of Dubai ports, where the very idea that an Arab company would be controlling some 5 or 6 American ports was seen as politically unacceptable. So it's an interesting turn of events that suddenly the gates of finance were open to, again, those kind of quote-unquote disreputable investors. And at that time, I wrote an article where I set up the kind of the nature of the debate. And the title of my article at that time was "Sovereign Wealth Funds to the Rescue: Are they saviors, predators, or dupes?" And at the time, I had a hunch that they were more dupes than anything else because they actually lost a lot of money in their investments. Now, in the world of finance, most people tend to be kind of a bit kind of amnesiac when it comes to matters of finance. That everybody's always looking at what happened yesterday and forgets what happened like a year ago, let alone 10 years ago. And one thing that happened in the world of finance is that everybody extrapolated from the trend that they had witnessed in the fall of 2007 to basically say, well, right now, sovereign funds are poised to buy up the entire universe, which was a replay of something that happened in the 1970s at the time of the first big oil boom, where there were expectations that there was going to be this major takeover of world business. What I got interested in is to look at what really happened in the 1970s and see if the experience of that time is going to be repeated. And to some extent, it has, in that, first of all, the extrapolation game started when one of the big investment banks in New York predicted the size of sovereign wealth funds. So you had this game of other investment banks coming up with other figures, and every day you'd hear about sovereign funds are now worth, say, $3 trillion. It means that by 2012 or 2015 or whatever the date, they'll be worth like $15 trillion. And the reality of it is that that's not the way the world works, in that we've seen with the price of oil a period of decline. But at the same time, my own focus has been more on the politics of what is going on within those countries involved. And here, basically, another word for sovereign wealth funds that is used in many instances is funds for future generations. So the idea is that you have countries that generate surpluses because either of oil or trade surpluses, and that surplus belongs to the people. So here you have a very big political question domestically, which is, first of all, does it make sense to invest overseas when the countries themselves have pressing needs? And the other question is, what happens when these investments turn out to be very bad investments, where essentially what's happening is that the future generations are losing out, and in some instances, significant amounts. Like anybody who looks at the evolution of stocks in many of those companies sees the extent of the losses. So my focus has been on this aspect of thing, the politics of what happens when a country has a lot of money. And I tend to contrast that with the conventional discourse on governance, because basically the way the recipient countries have responded to the entry of sovereign funds with that, well, we'll accept them if they have good governance, which is all very nice. Like, who can object to that? The only problem with the discourse of governance is that, in my view, it's a bit of a red herring. People talk about that, but at the same time, they overlook what is really taking place and what is really intellectually interesting. Now, another reason why I'm a bit skeptical of governance is that I do a lot of work on finance. And in my experience of finance, I've seen almost a correlation between talking a lot about ethics and violating ethics. In that there's a famous line by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American philosopher, where he said that whenever I have at my table somebody who talks a lot about how honest he is, when he leaves, I start counting my silverware. And so there's the view that sometimes when we talk a lot about something, it becomes a bit of a smokescreen to violate those rules. And so when you have almost like an industry where you have lots of seminars and papers being written and consultants talking about those issues, it's okay. Again, I'm not saying that it should not happen, but I don't think it's where the action is. So let me give you a very brief sense of what the political demands on sovereign funds are. There are first of all, there are the domestic demands. And we've seen already that, I travel a lot to the Gulf, and whenever you hear insiders, they always tell you that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the government is investing its money. Okay? if you look at the politics of Kuwait, you see that a lot of it, all of the upheavals in the last year or so in Kuwait have to do with matters of money. And in a minute, I'll talk a little bit about the recent history of Kuwait. Now, in addition to the domestic demands, you have regional demands, where you have, quote unquote, the Iranian threat that preoccupies many countries in the Gulf, and a lot of money is being invested for that. Now, you also have money going out of those countries for various regional projects. Here you can think, being in Lebanon, you can think of Qatar's role in terms of Lebanese politics. Then you have a number of other political issues in the region, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, where in many ways, when a country suddenly becomes rich, and it happened a lot in the 1970s, then lots of demands are put on them to fund all sorts of things. So essentially, to summarize, issues of war and peace are to be financed by those regional financial powers. And here there are lots of disputes over who's going to take what, especially in a context of shrinking pie, because this is really the problem. And then you have the international demands on countries like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, etc. Now, in recent years, there have been lots of memoirs published by a number of political figures in the US and in Saudi Arabia. And you keep hearing stories about how Saudi Arabia was supposed to pretty much underwrite many American adventures in foreign policy in areas that were very distant from the Middle East. So there was the view that the Saudis can afford to pay, and their role in international relations should be one of checkbook diplomacy, because they have so much money. So what you have, if you look at all of those factors together, you can see that it's not really a private equity logic that prevails. The private equity logic is one of looking at sovereign wealth funds as technocrats, or those who run them as essentially technocrats who make financial decisions based on financial criteria. The political element is far more important. To give you just small anecdotal evidence, you probably heard today and yesterday in the papers about the French having a military base in Abu Dhabi. Now, there have been lots of financial elements to that deal between France and the Emirates in terms of side deals, the kinds of side deals that involve finance and that don't necessarily make the headlines in the media. So obviously here, those decisions in terms of, for example, favoring investment in some French companies by sovereign wealth funds of the UAE, it's a purely political story. It's not at all financial story per se, that the criteria are not financial. Now, I want to talk briefly about Kuwait's experience after the first oil boom of the 1970s. Throughout the 1970s, Kuwait looked like it was ideally suited to take advantage of the oil boom, in that it had a tiny population and not major needs in terms of development and the like. And it had the reputation for many years of being the one country, the one oil exporting country that was very professionally managed in terms of its Kuwait Investment Office, now known as Kuwait Investment Authority. And it took the war, basically the first Gulf War in 1990, 1991, following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, to provide lots of revelations about the reality of the KIO at that time. In that, at the beginning of the war, namely on August 2nd, 1990, it was said that the KIO was worth about 150 billion US dollars. At a year later, the worth of the Kuwaiti sovereign wealth fund was about $30 billion. So in other words, a huge drop in terms of the value of it. Now, at the time, I had done some work on that, and the summary of the story of the Kuwaiti wealth fund was that, first of all, it became the piggy bank for the government in exile, basically, because the ruler of Kuwait and his family were mostly out of Kuwait. and for their living expenses, and also to pay for the war, they drew on that fund. But then the other interesting thing about Kuwait is that there was also lots of embezzlement that took place, mostly because of the ambiguity about who actually controlled Kuwaiti wealth overseas. But the part that's the most interesting is bad investments, in that despite the reputation for professionally run sovereign funds, it wasn't that professionally run at all. And all this was discovered because of the kind of revelation that come out of an event like the first Gulf War. Now, very briefly, I also want to mention that sometimes because of the boom, there is a bust, in that sometimes it gives a lot of self-confidence and hubris to the money managers who end up doing stupid things. In the case of Kuwait, one thing that happened that's ancient for many of you, that probably happened before the birth of some of you, was the so-called Souk al-Manakh debacle in the early 1980s, where essentially something like $90 billion in forged checks, actually in post-dated checks, so they were bad checks essentially, had to be covered by the Kuwaiti government because of speculation that happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I'm going to stop here. Maybe during the question period, I can talk some more about some of those issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Brahim. I'm going to just make a few comments about the question of the actual sovereignty and the nature of wealth. I don't come to this with the sort of academic expertise that the other panelists do, but I approach it more from my interest in sort of political economy and just basic issues of common sense, decency, and justice, really. They're just a very simple equation. The sovereign wealth funds represent an extraordinary store of money and cash wealth that is in the hands of governments that have generally tried to invest this money, I believe, with the best intentions of safeguarding the well-being of their own populations in the years ahead. I don't doubt the sincerity or the motives of the people in charge of this money in these countries that have this money, which is basically, we're talking of 4, maybe 5. But I think what I do question is the mechanisms by which the people of those countries, and by extension the people of the Arab world who are closely linked to those societies, the oil-producing societies, with trade, aid, and labor, and technical professional skills that come from the other Arab countries to help develop those oil economies, that those linkages between the oil economies and the non-oil economies need to be, I think, examined much more closely. The question of responsibility for managing this wealth is a question that is purely in the hands of those countries. They own that money. But I think that the wider issue is not just about UAE or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, but the question really is about the exercise of power in the contemporary Arab world. And the exercise of power in the contemporary Arab world, in the modern Arab state or the modern Arab security state that is sometimes called, the exercise of power essentially comes down to 2 important elements, the military and the money. Who controls the security and military police services, intelligence services? Who controls the money, the finances, the central government budgets, and the investment flows in the government or the private sector? The private sector has money in these societies as a derivative of money that came out initially from the central government, because it was mostly traced back to oil money, oil and gas. So even when we talk about the private sector and the public sector in many of these economies are very closely meshed. So the question becomes, I think, it's a question that I think is valid to talk about in the wider Arab sense, in who exercises power, how is power held accountable, what are the criteria for measuring how power is exercised, whether we talk about the performance of sovereign wealth funds in the last few years, whether we talk about the developmental experience of the Arab world in the last 40 or 50 years, whatever time frame, whatever region you look at, the questions in the end, I think, come back to the same ones. Who makes decisions? How is power held accountable? And ultimately, who are these decisions being made for? When small numbers of people, and you're talking of very small numbers of people, literally dozens of people in most cases, once very small numbers of people make decisions dealing with trillions and trillions of dollars and have, in some cases, lost hundreds of billions of dollars, is there any responsibility for that? Or is that okay to do and get away with? And this is not money that was, I'm not necessarily saying that money was stolen, but money was lost, irresponsibly lost in many ways. And not just about the current crisis. I think you have to go back over the last 30 years. And what the current crisis shows is that the exercise of economic power and responsibility by the ruling elite in the Arab world, I would say, has been erratic at best and mediocre generally. It's rare to see a really A performance, or B plus or A performance in terms of the management of Arab economic wealth. And the economic crisis now, I think, raises these issues more forcefully than ever, because it is precisely in a crisis when you can assess your real capacity to adjust and to get through the crisis. At one level, the Arab world hasn't been hit as hard as the rest of the world because we're partly detached from the global economy. We don't have strong links with the global economy. But the few links that we do have are being hit very hard. And I think it's probably fair to say that every single major source of income in the Arab world, every single major source of income has been hit very, very hard in this crisis. And we haven't seen the full impact of this crisis in the region. When you look at the drop in oil and gas exports, the price of oil and gas and the quantity of exports, when you look at foreign direct investment, when you look at domestic investment, intra-regional investment, tourism flows, remittance flows, aid flows, every single source of income in the oil and non-oil producing Arab countries has been hit very hard simultaneously. We've not yet seen this reality ripple through many of these economies. People are still living off their savings or somehow taking care of business. A lot of the stress is going to be hit on the low income and low, the middle income people who don't have the political clout to take care of themselves. But we're going to see, I think, serious impact from the economic crisis. But what it mainly shows is the fact that I think the Arab economic management, broadly speaking, in the last 40 years has been unable to take the human wealth, the natural wealth, the water and the land and the mineral wealth of the Arab world and translate that into a more viable regional economy that is able to withstand some of these short-term pressures that come with the with the current crisis. So there's, I think, valid questions that we need to ask about how do Arab governments manage wealth? How do they exercise power? And what we're seeing is, for instance, the questions being asked in many places. People are saying, well, why didn't the Arab world invest some of this money, say, in intra-regional agricultural and food industries? Obvious area for investment, the absorptive capacity of the Arab economies has been low. We know that since the 1960s. But there's a massive demand for investments in energy, in water, in agriculture, in food processing, in health, education, transport, and other basic infrastructure. The most fundamental aspects of human quality of life and social development and economic development, basic stuff that even a non-economist like me can understand. Why is it that we haven't had these big intra-regional investments? Is it political? Is it infrastructural? Is it technical? Or is it actually a question of sovereignty? The nature of decision-making in these countries is such that people decide, well, it's better to spend money on buying European car manufacturers or American bank stocks than investing in inter-regional issues. So these are questions that I raise, and I think it really raises the question of, when we talk about sovereign wealth, I would like to reverse that and ask about the wealth of sovereignty. I think this is the real question. What is the nature of our sovereignty as countries? And do we have a wealth of sovereignty, or do we have a deficiency in sovereignties? And I think part of the wider implications of what we're going through now is to say, fine, we've lost $400 billion, that's okay. We've also lost hundreds and billions of dollars in the last 20, 30 years, or wasted it, or some of it has been stolen. But we're going to lose large amounts of money. We've lost them before, but will we keep doing this generation after generation, or is this a time to take a pause and to ask about the nature of accountability? How do you make this kind of, these sums of money, this nature of power, how do you make it more accountable? We know from the corporate sector that good corporate governance, that includes transparency and accountability and participation by shareholders and decision making by people who are interlocked and accountable to each other, that good corporate government leads to better profitability, better corporate performance. Everybody benefits. The consumer benefits, the shareholders benefit, the managers benefit, the tax income of the country benefits. Good corporate governance works at the corporate level. Can we apply similar principles for the management of sovereign wealth funds? To have more input into decision making, more accountability, more advisors, more transparency about how this money is spent. This is not a question only of the countries that have sovereign oil funds or sovereign wealth funds. It's as I said, the wider question is about the exercise of power in Arab societies, the exercise of monetary power or military power that people hold. So I think this is an opportune moment to just raise these questions and to perhaps to encourage more and more citizens in these countries to raise these issues. I've been struck by how little analysis there has been done in public terms about the losses that have happened, but we should see the losses in this wider perspective of economic mismanagement going back about 2 generations. And I think it's time to say that that's enough. We've lost hundreds of billions of dollars, probably a couple of trillion over the last several generations, and it's time to try to do this in a more efficient and a more proficient and a more decent way. So those are the kinds of questions I think I would raise looking at this issue from the point of view of an Arab citizen, somebody who's interested in the exercise of power and the political economy of these societies, and encourage a wider debate and a more open debate based on the facts that we get from research such as my colleagues here have done. Thank you.
I hope I will also fulfill Rami's image of Germans who are not just in time, even more than that. I will speak about the Norwegian government pension fund, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. I had last year the opportunity to do some research on that. I had a scholarship to do research in Norway. And Norway, as you know, is one of the richest countries in the world. If you look on the Human Development Index rankings every year, Norway is 1 or 2. And all their wealth is based on the availability of oil and natural gas. The first natural gas field was discovered in 1959, the Groningen field. 10 years later, they found also oil. But the most interesting thing of Norway is that domestically they use renewable energies. They have a share of 99% of their electricity is produced by renewables, mainly hydropower. And if you think now all these hydropower stations were already in Norway before gas and oil were discovered, it's wrong. Most of the hydro plants installations were built after oil and gas was discovered in the 1970s and 1980s, which is interesting. The Norwegian Governmental Pension Fund, which is the official name of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the country, started in 1990, like in the Arab world, with the main intention to contribute to intergenerational justice, that if one day oil and gas are not available anymore, the country can still be a wealthy country, and for example pay the pensions and so on. Then what I will now talk about is the fact that at the end of the 1990s, Norwegian Norwegian governmental pension fund introduced so-called ethical guidelines for the investment policy of the fund. And there we have the first difference to what Rami was just talking about, who makes the decisions. In this part of the world, decisions are made top-down by a few people in the ruling families, whereas in Norway there was a broad public debate. What is the effect of our wealth for the world? What is done with the shares of our sovereign wealth funds? That the Norwegian governmental pension fund has shares of companies who produce extremely inhuman weapons, such as cluster weapons, and so on. And this was a broad public debate in Norway. And at the end, in 5 years ago, the Norwegian parliament decided the introduction of so-called ethical guidelines. This was in then times decided by a conservative government, now it's a left government, so there's continuity in supporting these ethical guidelines. It's not an issue of one specific political directions. The Norwegian governmental pension fund is, I'm using the data of 2007, the second largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. And the ethical guidelines consist of two main instruments. The first instrument is the so-called active ownership, and the second instrument is the so-called exclusion of companies. There are two different actors responsible for this. The active ownership, which I will explain in a minute, is in the responsibility of the State Bank of Norway, whereas the exclusion of company is in the responsibility of a new actor, which is the Ethical Council. Council of 5, I think they are all professors, who screen the global news to see whether the companies fulfill these ethical guidelines. And in the meantime, 28 companies were excluded from the Norwegian governmental pension fund. Sounds a lot, there are 8,000 companies in the fund, but 28, 20 of them because of the use of because of the production of inhuman weapons such as cluster weapons, and 8 companies for other reasons such as child labor, and in 4 cases for environmental reasons. It was in all cases the same reason, river dumping. There are 2 countries left in the world, Indonesia, and the other one I just forgot. 2 countries left in the world where river dumping is allowed, where you have companies who just put their oil waste from mining, for example, in river. And the Ethical Council said, we are aware that we cannot transfer the environmental standards from highly industrialized countries to developing countries, but river dumping is such a big harm of the environment. This should be not accepted, and the companies were not willing to change their policy. So this can be explained very easy. The second instrument, the exclusion of companies. The first one, the active ownership, is more complicated. The active ownership means that there is a new good governance department in the State Bank of Norway who is going into talks with companies where the fund has shares. And now it's 8,000 companies. These 8,000 companies have shares in another 800,000 companies. So it's 10 people who do this talk. So it's impossible to talk with all these companies. So they have to agree on what they focus. So in last year, when I did my interviews in Oslo, in the previous year in 2007, they had focused on having talks with US companies who were lobbying against climate change legislation in the US Congress. And in this talks, they try to convince them to change their behavior and show them that the worst option is that the Norwegian governmental pension fund is selling the shares. Whereas exclusion of company is very transparent, this is not the case with this active ownership. In the interviews it was told to me on which topics they had the talks, but not with which companies. And also for the good governance unit, it's difficult to measure the success of this. So there are these two key instruments. And now an evaluation process is taking place at the moment in Norway. And the government just announced that intends to overwork these both instruments. First of all, it wants to extend the list of companies it wants to exclude. It wants also to exclude companies who are working in the field of tobacco. And another thing is they are planning within the Sovereign Wealth Fund to launch an environmental investment program for the next 5 years of 20 billion Norwegian krones, which is about $3 billion US, to do specific investments in the field of clean energy, renewable energy companies, energy efficient companies, carbon capture storage companies, to be more active, not just exclude companies who do something that is from their point of view wrong, also to actively support companies who do something that they want to support. And this is maybe something which might also be interesting for the Arab sovereign wealth funds. We have now in Abu Dhabi, Sven mentioned Mabadala, who have launched the Master Initiative, which has several pillars. One of them is this Master Cities, this carbon neutral town, which is planned in Abu Dhabi. So we have at least one other case in that field here in this part of the world, but maybe other funds also want to look more into detail in this. Finally, for me as political scientist, it's always interesting to see policy innovations and their diffusion. And this is another interesting case to see. There's a lot of talk about globalization and the end of the nation state, but it's another example where a nation state is doing something and it works and others start to copy it, like a wave. And it's not other sovereign wealth funds who are copying it, but other actors from the financial world. So there are more than 20 funds in the world who have in the meantime copied the Norwegian ethical guidelines. Some of them large financial actors such as Generali from Italy, who manage funds which are much larger than this state fund. We should not forget sovereign wealth funds are just 2% of the whole volume of the global financial market. So I think this is the interesting thing, the diffusion of this policy innovation which takes place. And now Norway is also trying to, the International Monetary Fund and other actors on global level are looking very carefully what's going on in Norway. And maybe this might also influence that further diffusion of this innovation to implement ethical guidelines within sovereign wealth fund could take place in the future.
Thank you very much for all the panelists. Did anybody want to make any comment from the panel first before we open it up? All right, we open it up for your questions. We've got a microphone here, and this gives me the chance to thank Lana Salman here, who's taking the microphone, for organizing this event at our office. Thank you, Lana. If you can get the mic working, that would be great. Got it? Okay. Right in the back there. Rahim.
Thank you. My name is Ibrahim Saif from Carnegie Release Center here in Beirut. I have actually a couple of points to make. It's rather general. One is that it's related to Dr. Ibrahim's presentation, and I think we really need to be clear about the kind of a distinction that must be made between this mismanaging the fund and also the political motivations for some of the allocating money through the sovereign wealth fund. And if you have an idea when they started to name these as a sovereign wealth fund, because this is purely mutual funds basically, and they know that they are generation fund to protect the future generation, but I'm not sure if you have an idea when they started to name and call these as sovereign wealth fund. That would be good, because the name is quite peculiar, as Rami is trying to put it. Can I say the other things? Because also, and that probably goes to Ben's, is that how we really need to calculate the losses in the sovereign wealth fund. We're talking about trillions and billions, but do we have to look at the book values, how when we bought this, or you compare it to the peak price when this reached that level, because this would gives you an entirely different picture as to the real value of the sovereign wealth fund. And Rami, why you are claiming that the Arab economies are sort of disintegrated from the rest of the world, and this is why we are weathering this financial crisis? I would argue to the contrary, the Arab economies are quite open, and somehow they are integrated. And apart from probably a low level of FDI that is the region attracting, which is also a normal process because the region is an export of sort of capital to the rest of the world. So that I think somehow, if we to start saying this, I think that needs to be qualified. And I'm sorry for taking that long, but my last point is it's also for the international financial architect. It's that also the sovereign wealth fund has shifted their policies from buying purely treasury bills in the US to buying properties and assets. That shift also has sent signals even before the crisis and probably by the mid-90s when really they started to put their hand. And we can call on that is not only the case with the sovereign wealth fund in the region, but that's also the case with the sovereign wealth fund in Russia and in China, when there was some even discussions inside the US Congress about some of the deals that were conducted. And who is one of those deals that were rejected by the Congress and not purely on as a result of financial or economic decisions. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll start with a few comments about what you were just talking about. On your question about when exactly the word started being used, I'm not really sure. Do you know when?
2005.
Yeah, so it's actually quite recent, and there's another interesting thing about the fact that it's so recent, is that sometimes, like social scientists, always warn against temptation simply to name something and to assume that by naming it, they're explaining it. And I think that the thing about sovereign funds is that it became something like a magic mantra, in that essentially, if you want to look at what sovereign funds are, it's part of the national foreign exchanges that is spun off and managed autonomously and mostly investing as a private equity investor, basically. So what is interesting in terms of the history of finance is that this coincided with the private equity boom of the period roughly between 2004 or so up to 2007. And what happened at that time, and it's interesting in terms of using, again, the notion of sovereign funds, some kind of magic concept, was that a number of countries, most prominently France, were saying, oh, we need to create our own sovereign fund. So in a number of countries, around 2007, when there was all that talk about sovereign funds, there was the assumption that simply by creating a sovereign fund, which again is not a big deal other than spinning off some money for private equity investing, then you'd be doing a good thing. So the French discourse on that, when France created its sovereign funds, and there are 3 countries actually that created their sovereign fund after the big boom of 2007, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and France, are newcomers to the world of sovereign And when they created their fund, there was the assumption that by doing so, it was a brilliant move because suddenly they're going to be making a lot of money instead of simply investing in very conservative instruments, the way countries traditionally did it. So I think the other parts of your questions I'll leave for other people.
And the point I made about the Arab economies is simply that, maybe I should phrase it differently, but simply that the Arab economies are not engaged in global activities other than largely exporting mineral products and importing consumer and industrial goods. We don't have those strong productive links with the global economy, and therefore the impact of the economic crisis in the Arab world is, from what I read by respected economists, has been a little bit less than it has been in other places so far, and partly it's because these links are less, but I think the total impact of the economy in the Arab world, the total impact of the global crisis is yet to be fully play itself out, and we're going to see some serious pain when it comes to lower income people, lack of social safety nets, and Arab governments, to their credit, are understanding this, and some of them are scrambling to do things, and in some cases the Arab countries that have wealth in terms of surplus oil income and sovereign wealth funds they don't have the monetary instruments and monetary and fiscal instruments to use like other countries do, more developed economies, but they're using basically deficit spending and raising their subsidies and pumping money into the capital markets and the banking systems. So I think at one level we're seeing the Arab countries being a little bit more responsible in responding to the short-term pressures and using what they can, which is to inject some money if they have it. But I think the net conclusion from when you look at the crisis now in the Arab world is there's very little cushion for the Arab economies to absorb these stresses, and they have very little capacity to be more productive and to rely on their own resources.
Talking about sovereign wealth funds is always a bit like, how do you say, like Kremlinology? How do you say that? Criminology. So, when we try to, back in the old days when we talked about the Soviet Union and Brezhnev and who would follow. Kremlinology. So it's a difficult word to use. So it's really sort of, talking about sovereign wealth funds is something like that. Interesting. The most interesting case in this probably is the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, where you had like 12 months ago, where everybody speculated Abu Dhabi Investment Authority is like sort of $875 billion US. It's a lot. Even some even said 1 trillion. It's even more, a lot of zeros. Now the most recent speculations talk about 330. So there's somewhere a gap of $500 billion. This is half of the G20 stimulus package. So I find that very, very interesting. The $875 billion speculation in the West caused a lot of turbulences and caused policymakers really to react. So I would really talk about the politics of speculation. People speculated about the Abu Dhabi Investment Authorities and others. They speculated about how much sovereign wealth funds would be worth in 2015, 12 trillion or whatever it was. And that number that somebody came up with, it was actually an analyst from Morgan Stanley, Stephen Jen. He produced it probably on a napkin. I hope it was not stained. But that number was really used throughout the IMF, the World Bank, different national governments, and so on and so forth. And it was used to produce or to stimulate a certain political process. I find that extremely intriguing, and I find it also intriguing in the context of understanding agenda setting in a globalized world, where we have media, where we have agenda setters being able, through the power of media, through information, driving politics into a certain into a certain direction. So the politics of speculation. The politics of speculation, the question then that I would ask me, and perhaps also I would like to ask Ibrahim on this. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, or the management of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, let it go. It's quite interesting. And they actually said, didn't do anything about this. They actually said, you know, we're sitting on our money and we keep our mouths shut. And whatever happens there, whatever political processes, upheaval, I mean, whatever, we don't, you know, we don't manage that. So we let it pass. So the politics of speculation. Is there anything that you would advise the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority to do better? Just two more points. The politics of shock for Rami. Politics of, I mean, so we lose the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, just to stick to this point, $500 billion US. I mean, this is shocking. How much more pain needs there to be in the Arab world to really move on that issue? Not a couple of, you know, experts, a couple of journalists, but where you really say, you know, this is something that needs to be taken on board in the public policy discourse in the Arab world. I mean, where do you see that going? And the third point, perhaps, to Dania, the politics of education and learning. I mean, you have been here now for half a year or something like that. How do you see the openness of the Arab world, the lust of the Arab world to learn a little bit more from the Norwegian example? I mean, the Norwegian example strikes me as a very useful example. There's transparency, there's sustainable development, there's all these wonderful things. So now, after your experiences here, how would you maneuver the politics of education? So that's my questions. I took these 2 minutes back.
I have to laugh about this question. It's difficult to answer, but from my field of, from my research on environmental policy, there are rankings, the degree of openness to adopt policy innovations. And for example, the United States in the past, either they were the innovator or they didn't act on a policy. So they want to be always the first, but they are not willing to adopt others' policies. Whereas the Scandinavians, they are both. They are either innovators or they are adopting others' policies. It's very difficult for me to see how it is in this part of the world. Everybody wants to have the biggest mosque, the highest tower. Adopting other policies, I don't know. But I think what the challenge for all these countries with sovereign wealth funds is the same. One day, oil and natural gas are not available anymore. So, economic diversification has to be done. And one has to be prepared for the day when there is no income anymore from these sources. And if you use domestically renewable energy, like Norway is doing, then you are prepared for the day when oil and gas are not available anymore, because then you don't have to buy it from others. And now it's very interesting, I think, what is going on in Abu Dhabi with the Master Initiative, which is not just Master City, which is several investments over the whole globe in the field of renewable energy. And so now they are pioneering with this, and one has to see whether other Gulf countries also adopt this. There are some signs for this. Oil start with their renewable energy projects, but it's at this moment very difficult to say the openness of adopting such a huge innovation like the Norwegians did with their ethical guidelines. By the way, if I might say, I'm not so good in advertising that I brought my paper, but now I will put it in the camera and say you that you just have to Google my name and write
applies to the big ones as well as to the small ones, not just the Gulf Emirates, but if you look at historically Iraq or Algeria or Libya, these are countries where power, citizenship, and responsibility live in three separate realms. They're not all sort of brought together in one process. So the citizen is taken care of by the state, and if the state loses $300 billion, but it still has another 500, then that makes no difference in the lives of ordinary people, because the state is still going to take care of the citizens of those states. So detaching citizenship from responsibility from governance has been one of the peculiar attributes of modern Arab oil economies. There's no sign anywhere in the Arab world of citizen action that can bring about real accountability of power. And the two realms that I mentioned, the civilian oversight of the military, or civilian or popular or civilian oversight of the financial sector in the Arab world. There isn't a single country in the Arab world, which is bizarre. And this is an Arab problem. It's not an Islamic problem. It's not a Middle Eastern problem. Because if you look at Turkey, for instance, they've had a different trajectory. But there's something in the exercise of power in Arab societies that leads us to this situation. There's other reactions against this, against the exercise or the mismanagement of power. But I don't think the shock element is going to actually bring about any repercussions. And what you see in both the oil countries and the poorer non-oil countries is the same reaction by citizens, which is they just go to their governments and demand that their governments take care of them, to give them more money or give them more telephone lines or free medical care or subsidized food. So there's this peculiar, so I think the issue is the relationship of citizen to state and the nature of sovereignty.
Yeah, I want to answer to a couple of Sven's questions. One is about the politics of speculation, in the sense of like when a number is invented and how it takes on a life of its own. It's a subject that always fascinated me. And actually, I gave a talk a few months ago organized by Rami's Institute, where I talked about the financial war on terror. And in that talk, I explained how a figure was created out of thin air, which was that Osama bin Laden had $300 million. And then the financial war on terror was essentially a quest for these $300 million. So it was a very consequential guess about that. And the story of it, I tried to go back to the origin of that rumor. It was simply a junior State Department analyst who was asked when bin Laden's name appeared on the radar screen, basically asked, how much money does this guy have? And so this person, probably a very young person, like an intern or something like that, wanted to answer, and he had no clue as to how to answer it. So he ended up making up a figure based on two fake numbers. The first one was, he said, well, let's figure out the size of the bin Laden group, and he came up with $5 billion. And then he said, okay, now let's figure out how many sons bin Laden has. And without knowing that daughters also inherit. So the whole thing was completely crazy. And then he came up with $5 billion divided by 20. So he came up with $250 million. He rounded it up to $300 million. And then everybody started repeating that figure. So when I wrote my book, I did a Google search of bin Laden and $300 million. And I found something like 250,000 hits. Because every single article about bin Laden was repeating that invented figure. And yet it was pretty much the basis for the financial war on terror. So this quest for those $300 million, where are they? And lots of people got bothered, and in some cases their money was frozen, etc., on the ground that this is maybe where it's hiding. So very often numbers get invented, and it's quite consequential. So this figure by Morgan Stanley was one that spurred other analysts to come up with their own figure. And so the whole thing turned out to be completely fictional. The other point that Sven made was how come the Abu Dhabi government never responds to estimates of their wealth, in that when people say, well, it's $800 billion or so. Well, it's, if you think about it, it's kind of a no-win proposition to come up with an answer, especially keeping in mind the lack of transparency in that country. But it's a no-win because if they say it's less than that, then people will be angry and they'll say, well, how come we only have this, given that it's the fund for future generations? And if they say it's more than that, then there are going to be more claims on that money. In terms of what I was talking about earlier, in terms of, again, domestic and internationally. For example, during the G20 meeting recently, countries, like wealthy countries, were asked to contribute the largest amounts of money to the IMF, etc. So it's a bit of a dilemma. So the strategy of the government of Abu Dhabi is basically the way the British would deal with questions of espionage, which is basically to say no comments, or to say it kind of more diplomatically in terms of couching it in lots of verbiage as a way of not answering the question. And then another way of looking at it, since we're there's a Lebanese expression that you probably all know, which is "sit ghina wala sit far," which is that people say, well, let's just be assumed to be rich, and that's the end of it.
Sven, do you want to say something?
No, leave it, no.
Okay. Alice?
Thank you. I have a question for Brahim about Abu Dhabi, the French base. You mentioned that this might be not the major story. The major story is side deals on that. Would you elaborate a little more what kind of deals and what is the real major story? Is it the base or what goes beside?
No, I think the story of the base is an important story, certainly in terms of French military presence in the region. But the thing about it is that while this was being negotiated and agreed on, because I think the formal inauguration was yesterday or so, but prior to that, there have been lots of very interesting stories in terms of, for example, saving a nuclear company in France, and the Germans were split out. I forgot the details of that story because I looked at it a few months ago. But basically, it was an arrangement whereby France would allow Abu Dhabi to invest in a nuclear company. And that's the kind of thing which normally would cause a huge outcry. So my point was not necessarily that finance was the main reason, but it's that you cannot explain what Abu Dhabi is doing in connection with France without keeping in mind the politics behind it, that it's not a financial decision. Because I think that one of the mistakes commonly made when people discuss sovereign funds is to discount this political element. Now, another thing that is quite interesting in terms of the psychology of asking for money of a rich country is that it's very difficult, for example, when you're, let's say, the US ambassador and you go to Saudi Arabia and you ask the king for some financial aid, it's very hard to believe that the government is actually broke. Because essentially, the paradox here, that the country is very rich, but then at the same time, the country isn't sitting on a lot of liquidity. And here, there's a quote that I have from someone who was in the news a few weeks ago, Chaz Freeman, who had been ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And he was quoted as saying, because he was ambassador to Saudi Arabia in roughly between 1990 and 1992. So he was the one who was basically asking the Saudis to pay for the Gulf War. And his quote is actually that there was simply disbelief in Washington that Saudi Arabia could be cash poor, because he kept going to the Saudi rulers with requests to fund various things on the ground that Saudi Arabia is made of money. And the Saudis were saying, no, we've already paid too much. We can't pay for everything. And at the same time, again, the outside view is that, again, those people are made of money. And they say, oh, no, we cannot finance this or that thing. That's why part of the political aspect I was talking about is that you have a lot of competition for a shrinking pie and lots of demands, both domestic, regional, and international. So the country is obviously rich. None of those Gulf countries will ever be completely broke because of all the oil they have. But given all the demands made on their money, the way it's being allocated is more political than financial. There might be small segment of it that is run according to financial criteria. But the bulk of it is really motivated by these political considerations.
Well, I would just add to that. I think the definition of rich, and that's one of the points I was making. How do you measure wealth? You know, is a little village in rural Morocco that lives off its cattle and agriculture wealthier than a country that requires foreign military bases to take care of it? I don't know. That's a question that I think we need to ask these questions about the criteria for national sovereignty and national wealth and national well-being. This is a debate that has to happen within the Arab world. And how do you define security? Is security a military function, or is it a function of being able to withstand changes in your economic environment and being able to take care of your children in hard times without having to run to somebody to bail you out or protect you? We're getting Arab countries now, some of the wealthy ones, investing huge amounts of money in agriculture in Pakistan and East Africa and different places in non-Arab countries, Vietnam, buying large amounts of land to, you have to wonder, is that the best way for these countries to have food security? Or is there a better way to do it sort of closer to home? Again, I don't have the answers, but I think these are the questions that we need to talk about.
Yeah, if I may add one point to what Rami was saying, one thing that we haven't mentioned is weapons purchases, which is that very often when there is this sudden inflow of wealth, obviously it's not the sovereign funds themselves would buy the weapons, but money is fungible. So it means that that would be kind of less money for the sovereign funds. You know, there are other investments, but it's part of that same logic. And here, again, many security threats, quote unquote, might be greatly inflated for all sorts of reasons. And it goes back to Rami's question about, again, the question of sovereignty and the security needs.
Any other questions, comments? I'll wait for the mic.
Thanks. I wanted to know about the policy transfer from Norway. So when other countries or other organizations want to cherry pick the Norwegian good governance, transparency, appropriated companies, what do they cherry pick and what do they seem to avoid in terms of what they want for themselves?
First of all, policy transfer, the experience shows that it first takes place on a regional basis before it takes place globally. So, for example, all the 4 Swedish pension funds copied the Norwegian ethical guidelines, and then other European financial actors, such as generally from Italy, which I mentioned. I think what one can gain is trust, is credibility, is acceptance, and this is especially important if you are living in societies with lively civil societies where you have to meet special expectations. So I think this is what you gain. And the interesting thing is that I mentioned that several private financial actors copied it, and I think for them it's also an instrument in competition to say we are more responsible than other competitors.
Any other comments? Well, there's one thing there. Go ahead.
Very brief question. You mentioned the issue of accountability, mostly of sovereign. Yeah, you mentioned the issue of the accountability of sovereign wealth funds, mostly in Arab states, whereas we're talking about wealthy Gulf states, which are monarchies, and they don't have political accountability to begin with. So this is a comment. I would question whether these countries would provide the accountability, in regards to their sovereign wealth fund. Now, my question is, if they become accountable, do you think that this could lead to more political accountability?
Yes, I think if there were more accountability, it would spread from political to economic to military to other fields. The countries of the Gulf and others, other monarchies around the region would say that they do have accountability, but it's a different kind of accountability than, say, Western parliamentary democracies. So they would say they are accountable, they take care of their people, they consult their people, they have feedback mechanisms, they have mechanisms to hear complaints, and those are issues that the citizens of every Arab country have to look at and decide if they're the best mechanisms. The reason that I mention this is because I think it is an example of wider accountability challenges around the Arab world. The second thing is that these are not islands of isolated national development. I think there is an element of appropriate questioning from countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, etc., because the Gulf countries were able to develop so quickly, partly because they drew on massive manpower, educated, trained manpower that came from these countries. And of course they paid them salaries, and it was a win-win situation. But I think it's interesting for people to look back on the last 40, 50 years, especially since the first oil boom of the early 70s, but even going back to the initial oil burst of the 50s, the two areas where you've had significant Arab interaction and integration to some extent are labor flows and investment flows. Now the investment flows maybe didn't go into productive industries, they went into real estate, speculation, whatever, some of them. But labor flows have been, the remittances from labor flows have been quite a spectacular example of inter-Arab integration, or something close to integration. So I think that should be a good history, legacy to study, that when you do have mutually beneficial flows, everybody benefits. And I think the question then becomes, well, can we use the resources of the Arab world, land, water, human beings, and minerals, and money now, to develop more of this kind of integration? I think that's the real question. But accountability, I think, more accountability would probably push all the Arab countries to work more rationally and intelligently together without sacrificing their political sovereignty or identities. I think you'd get, if you looked at the non-oil countries, Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, whatever, you would also find more accountability. Would probably, the citizens of those countries would like to have more normal, open relations with other countries. So better accountability anywhere in the Arab world, I think, would lead to more openness, more integration, politically as well as economically.
I mean, just follow on this question on accountability. Perhaps Sven was mentioning it, but is there at the beginning any knowledge about the sums of the budgets? I mean, the budgets are probably not published of the sovereign wealth funds. But on the other side, I mean, there might be companies which have to publicize their shareholders and investment coming from outside. Is there a mean from this side, not from the side of the donor of the sovereign wealth fund, from the side of the spending, to have any knowledge about which sums we are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so it's very difficult to come from the equity side in a way. I mean, it's really a Sisyphus thing to do, because money sovereign wealth funds actually don't do direct investments, but they actually go through intermediaries, and then you have to sort out what the intermediaries are, and so on and so forth. So that makes it really, really complicated. There's a very good study that has just been produced by a consulting group, the Monitor Group, that has actually produced a database on that, the trades that sovereign wealth funds have done in the past couple of years. It's a huge exercise. There's others, think tanks, Council on Foreign Relations is very active in this. Others who produce a couple of numbers. I mean, again, sort of idea 800 billion down to 330. Then you have the Kuwait Investment Authority at 260, something like that. The Qataris at 60, 70 billion. Then you have Mubadala at 10, 12, something like that. Mubadala actually serve a very interesting example. They just published their first annual report. So you have the numbers really there. I mean, this is a first-class report. If every sovereign wealth fund was as transparent and as professional like that, then we wouldn't have that problem. You had Kuwait, you have Qatar, you have Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, and the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, which I said 400 to 500 billion US dollars. So, and then you have a couple of smaller ones. I mean, like the famously unfavorable ABAR, some wealth funds, Abu Dhabi based, which just recently took a stake in Daimler. It's quite interesting. A stake 2 billion US dollar, 9% in Daimler. So you have now a situation. I mean, we can really go into become very granular about this. In Abu Dhabi, you now have a situation where you have a proliferation of sovereign wealth funds. All of a sudden, you know, you had the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, then you had IPIC, and all of a sudden you have Mubadala, then you have ABAR, and then you know you have all sorts of things popping up, which makes it all very complicated. To go into Dubai is even messier, I would say, because there you can't really differentiate between what is the government's, what's the government entity, and what's an investment vehicle of the ruling family, because that is completely overlapping. There's cross-shareholdings all over the place. So it's extremely difficult to find out who has what. I mean, you know, since we're talking a little bit about Germany, it's quite interesting there, you know, because it's a reduced number of Arab investors that are going, for example, in Germany. I come from Germany, therefore I have a bit of an interest there. You have in Daimler the Kuwait Investment Authority and ABAR, which altogether makes 16% in Daimler, which is quite interesting. You have 3% of the Dubai International Financial Center, 3% in Deutsche Bank. You have IPIC, which took 70% of MAN Ferrostal, and so on and so forth. So all in all, I think Arab sovereign wealth funds have invested 7 to 8 billion US dollars in German companies, which is quite interesting. But I mean, this is like, as I said, I mean, this is a hugely time-intensive and resource-intensive exercise. But the intellectual or the research community is getting there. I mean, I'm extremely intrigued how people in the financial services industry, in the consulting or professional services industries, the academic community and the think tank community actually sort of come together, and it's like a little bit like a sportive exercise. You know, it's a little bit of a competition where you say, you know, I found that bit of information, I found that bit of information, and more and more there comes an interesting image emerges, which becomes, I hope, more and more accurate and reflective of the real situation.
All right.